And bingo, bango, bongo. We are live, Tomash, back in the podcast here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me again.
It's fantastic to be back together here. So, Tomash, this is the Yolo Uncovered podcast we're doing today to explore some of the portfolio companies that the great fund of Yolo has been able to work with over the last couple of years. And Tomash, you founded Kero Sports a couple of years ago. And so I just want to start off today by, can you talk a little bit about why did you start Kero Sports? What is your mission? What is your purpose? And what is the product?
Yeah, that's a great question. For most of my professional life, I've been a technologist, let's just say. So I've built a lot of cool things, primarily in the kind of mass consumer technology space. And as an avid fan of sports, I always thought that sports betting, the way that it was, let's say 5 years ago, when I started kind of thinking about the vision for the company, it was too much of a prosumer experience in that you needed to be a professional, or at least somebody that thinks they're a professional sports bettor, to be able to engage with that product. If you're a casual user, or like myself, a casual fan of sports, sports betting was too intimidating. And I think if you analyze any mainstream technology today, typically there is that progression from it becomes even the PC itself or the smartphone, etc. There's always this evolution from there are some early adopters who are highly technical or skilled within that domain. And then over time, what happens is the technology becomes a little bit easier for the mass market to adopt and use, right? So I use the iPhone as an example for that in a couple of conferences where when the iPhone came out, Steve Ballmer of Microsoft said, we're not worried about it because it doesn't have a keyboard. And what he was saying was the professional users of smartphone in those times were BlackBerry users, and they needed keyboards so they could write long emails and kind of check their email on the go and all of that stuff. And he said, well, they're missing this key feature that will ensure that the professionals don't adopt it. But what happened next? Consumers realized, well, we don't need a keyboard. We can just work off of a digital keyboard. And then that mainstream adoption ended up cannibalizing or killing the prosumer market as well for the BlackBerry. And then now we all have iPhones and Androids, right? So my thesis was kind of the same. It was, how do you make sports betting such that an average person who doesn't necessarily bet on sports 20 times a day can engage with it? And the specifics of that vision became around this notion of let's create shorter dopamine loops, right? Instead of people betting on what's going to happen in tomorrow's game, let them bet on what's happening right now in the game that I'm watching so that it's tied to what it is that I'm seeing on the screen. And the cycle should be much faster, right? So they should bet on smaller things versus the outcome of the game or the outcome of a bunch of games, etc. And in addition to that, abstract the exercise of choice and search, right? Because today consumers still have to go into a sports book and look through dozens of different menu options and categories and pick the one thing that they're looking for. Abstract that and give them the thing that is probably most exciting for people to bet on based on what's happening in the game. And so those two things, shorter cycle times plus what we call a recommendation, became the initial vision for how we're going to execute on that mission of kind of creating a mainstream sports betting product. And I think, let me pause here because I don't want to go into my whole story, but hopefully that gives you a sense for what it was that we were trying to achieve and ultimately have achieved as we've grown as a company and now work with many different partners within the ecosystem.
Right. Micro betting has become one of the most exciting trends that has come out of, especially the North American kind of market in the last couple of years. And to that end, you are not alone, obviously, in fabricating this idea, and you have a pretty strong incumbent, especially in North American market that you're competing against. Can you talk a little bit more about perhaps what are kind of the biggest challenge that you have faced in your entrepreneurial journey so far, going up against these big, well-funded companies, for example, or how has this journey been for you to execute this idea?
I think it always depends on the stage, right? At every stage of the process, you have the biggest challenge. So what it is today is not what it was last year, and what it was last year is not what it was the year before that. I think from the start, as most entrepreneurs find, you have this kind of validation problem, right? Because I didn't go out to the market with an idea. I actually self-funded and got our product and company to a fairly decent kind of early stage before we went out and raised funds and started to engage with sports books and all that. So at that time, the challenge was, how do I show and communicate to people that there's something here, right? And what I've learned through that journey is, as a technical co-founder, or sorry, as a technical founder, my challenge was that I always focused on the technology and the product, right? And I never told the story of like what this company could be. Because ultimately, when you're raising funds, what you have to help people understand is what this business can become. It has nothing to do with the technology for the most part. Like, obviously the technology has to be there, it's a checkbox, but it has to be the story of the business. And so at that time, that was my biggest problem. And then I luckily had some smart folks around me that kind of helped me pivot what I talk about and how I present and all of that stuff. Then as we got our initial funding, we did 3 rounds in the last 20 months, let's say, which was great. And once we got some funding, then the problem became, well, hiring smart folks, because what happens is suddenly you go from an organization of 6 to an organization of 12. And now you have to create kind of leaders of X, right? So you need like a head of X and Y. And so that was pretty, not challenging per se, but I think that was really, really important for us to do right, where we hired our head of product from TikTok. We brought in a head of data science who was, prior to that, kind of like a Moneyball role in a sports team. We brought in a head of technology, a head of sales. And so, okay, then you kind of go through that maturation step. And now you're at the point of, okay, now we need to get proper customers. We need to get, we're building a live betting technology. Like, how do you even know if this thing makes money, right? Or if people are going to be attracted to it. So that's where our second round came in. And that's when the good folks at Yolo invested. And we're super glad that they did, because they've been so instrumental in helping us figure out, like, how do we kind of not just validate, but bring to market this technology that we're building. And now it's all about kind of scaling, right? So then you mature, and now you have something, and it makes money for folks and for yourself. How do you now deliver that to the world, right? So there's always a different challenge, I think. And at some point, I hope we'll have the problem of sustaining, right? Like, how do you sustain it? How do you defend it against others coming in and all that stuff? But we're not there yet.
Right. It's a never-ending kind of climbing the mountain journey that we're on as entrepreneurs. And I would like to talk about your experience with fundraising as well, Tomash. As you mentioned here before, you raised capital 3 times so far to Kero Sports. Every time, as far as I'm aware, it's been an up round, so the valuation of the company keeps climbing. And what is interesting with you, I think, Tomash, is that you come from outside of the industry. So in a way, you started Kero Sports without perhaps the great industry network that other entrepreneurs enjoy. And you raised capital when the markets was really hot. You raised capital when VC funding kind of came down to earth a bit as well. And so can you talk a little bit more about perhaps your best advice in how to best raise capital, and what perhaps was the difference between the first raise, the second raise, and the third raise, and what's your best advice in general for someone looking to raise capital for the first time to their gritty startup?
Look, I think the cyclical nature of the market, to some extent, did not apply to us, and it did not apply to us for a specific reason. The general sort of like disposition for folks to say, "Oh, it was really easy to raise market at a specific money at a specific time." Well, yes, it was. Why? Because the market was misaligned, right? And so, like, the only thing that happened was there's a bit of a realignment, and like what happens when a realignment takes place is not that the buy side goes away. investors even today, even though the market is, let's say, not in a good place, are still looking for good companies, right? It's kind of like a dating market. So people are still looking for each other, and your job as an entrepreneur is, in my opinion, to do two things. One is tell your story right? So you have to present yourself out there. Like if you're in the dating market, well, you got to dress up nicely and shave your beard and cut your hair and all that stuff, right? But beyond that, you have to be a good company that executes. So to some extent, we weren't affected, but I think we weren't affected because what we did was pre-first round, we executed really well. As I said, I self-funded. I got us to a specific, point where we knew we could have we had some validation points around us. And then we raised a little bit of capital, executed really well with that capital, raised another round, executed really well with that. And so at any point when I would talk to folks, I could show the trajectory, right? We didn't just raise $1 million and kind of stayed the status quo. We did something. We created, exponential leaps between the time when we raised and now. And so people had the confidence that, okay, we're obviously very hungry. We're doing something right. We're getting validation. So again, the buy side didn't go away. It's still looking for good companies. And so I think you have to be a good company. You have to execute and also tell your story right. And I think what happened in the kind of the good times was if you just told a nice story, it would be easier to raise because the market was off. But that shouldn't be the status quo, right? Like that should just be something that helps you versus something that you rely upon.
Right. So essentially, investors started to swipe left more as the market came down, to use your dating analogy, full circle here, basically. So you got to dress up your profile a bit better than before, perhaps.
You got to dress up and got to be a good person. Got to be a good company.
That's right, Tomash. And to that end, to your own founder journey and the years in Kero Sports so far, can you give some advice, perhaps, of those who are thinking about going on this entrepreneurial journey? What have the kind of big lessons for you? What have you learned during this journey, and what do you think it takes to become a successful entrepreneur?
In terms of tactical stuff, I think what I do see from some guys that they're doing really well is building a network of kind of entrepreneurs and angel guys. Like our industry is so small, and there are maybe I'll put some names out there, right? Benji, Lloyd, right? Like you have these guys who are so smart. Have been very successful, and again, they're on the buy side, so like they're looking for companies, right? But people go, actually, this was one of my mistakes, where I've wasted so much time talking to major Silicon Valley funds, and it's not like I was chasing them. They would give me the time, so I would go through 2 or 3 meetings and then get to nowhere, and that was a mistake, in my opinion. If you're in the sports betting industry, there is a very well-established network of people who are looking for you if you dress nice and are a good person. That you should probably start there, because those guys can quickly help you get to that validation point, and that's what I've seen with with the folks that I've named and a bunch of others. And I think I see some guys doing that now. And the other good tip is reach out to other founders, right? Because we want nothing more than to help someone else who's a little bit earlier than us. It's sort of part of the process, right? Like you just want to help somebody. But again, in my opinion, you should have something more than just a presentation. And you should be constantly, like every time you speak to somebody, you should say, hey, by the way, since we last talked, I did X, Y, and Z. And people love that. And if you do that enough times, suddenly you become remembered as the guy that executes, or the girl. So I think that combination of you got to execute despite what you don't have, and reach out to the right network within the industry because it's there and it's waiting for you. And I think that will help catalyze your startup, if it's a good one, right? Like not everybody's necessarily going to have the right idea and whatever, but those are absolute must steps, in my opinion.
Right. And in your own experience, Tomash, how much does investors emphasize you as the founder and kind of the drive that you have and the mentality that you have versus perhaps the idea itself behind Kero Sports when they take a decision to invest in your company?
I don't want to speak for them. I think it's definitely early stages. It's very important. I've certainly heard that from a few folks that said, what we're doing is we're really investing in you. But I certainly hope that they also like what the company was trying to achieve and is achieving now. Again, I think ultimately you have to think about what is the business, right? Because what eventually has to happen is you have to make more money than you spend. That has to happen, not just have a cool product that a lot of people use and whatever. It has to make money. So if you can build that story in your head and you think you can build it in real life, then I think it's a combination of those two things. Like, I don't think it's one or the other, but certainly it has to be both, you know? So again, my biggest issue was I used to talk a lot about how cool this product is and how many people like it and what the engagement is and all of that stuff, but that's not a business. And luckily I had somebody, maybe I'll shout him out as well, Chris Grove, shout out to you, who said, look, it needs to be a business, not a product. And that was at the time when the market was hot, and he was saying a lot of products are getting funded right now, but ultimately it has to be a business. So that stuck with me for a long time.
Right, you have some great mentors and supporters, of course, behind the business. Tomash, great friends of ours, of course. I want to ask you as well, as an entrepreneur in your experience, is there such a thing as a work-life balance, or is there more of a work balance, perhaps?
I've got 2 young kids as well. So I have no personal life. I have family time and I have work time. And luckily my family is not, they're on the ship with me. So if I spend, like this weekend, I spend probably, 10, 20 hours, watching football, looking at how our markets are doing and all of that stuff. Cause it's very important for me to do that. And my wife does not mind. So that's good. But no, I think if you're single, your life could actually help with work, because a lot of time that you spend out socially could be done to advance your company's objectives, right? You could be out at dinners with people, etc. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But no, I think you have to, it's kind of like having a child. Because for me, what happened was my first was born right as I was starting the company, and I could see both through this journey of, okay, well, you have this thing initially it's a concept, and then the concept starts to drink milk, but not do much else. And then it starts to crawl, and then it could walk, and then it could talk. And, so, and the company is kind of the same way, because you have an idea, and then you have some concepts, and then you build the tech behind it, and then you pilot it. And then, so it's the same sort of progression, and you have to teach it. You have to give so much energy into it to hopefully get it back eventually. So I don't think you can just work 20 hours a week if you're starting a new company. But social life could be part of work life is what I'm saying, right? Because again, the key things are networking, hiring smart people, which you could do by meeting more people, investors, prospects, customers, right? But I speak from a B2B standpoint, but even on the B2C side, you could meet partners, etc. So I don't think it's I don't think you could coast through it, but I think you could have fun doing it, which is what I did, certainly.
Right. So the point is kind of like your personal life and your work life kind of had to blend together to some extent in order to enjoy the journey that you're on. Essentially, as an entrepreneur, I think that's a good lesson for anyone who wants to start a company. It is not the easiest of routes to take professionally, that's for sure.
That's the key anyways, right? Like to enjoy the journey. Like I think you have to be, because otherwise there's no guarantee on the other side, right? So if you're not enjoying it, you're purely doing it for some economic outcome, and that's not guaranteed. And so if you don't win, then you've wasted and will hate your decision. But if you focus on something that you enjoy and have fun through the journey, it almost, not that it doesn't matter what the outcome is, but it's, you've played the game the right way, and I can't remember the name of the book, but I was reading this book that talked about how the greatest companies they don't treat their business as a game, because a game has a start and a stop, a winner and a loser, right? So you could approach anything in that kind of game framework where, okay, by December 2024, we will either win or lose, and that's it. And certainly that's true in some specific things, but the greatest companies are all about building a culture of kind of curiosity, sustainability, growth, and then that just becomes the framework through which they play the game, and they just continue to evolve forever, because you will eventually, if you have that culture, you'll pivot to the right things, you'll add things, you'll kill things, etc., and you'll continue to win. But there is no stop, right? Like there is no moment when you say, okay, we're the loser, these guys are the winners, and that's it. Because in life, as long as you're alive, you continue to play. So it's important to play in the right way. And I think part of that is enjoying the journey, for sure.
The journey is the reward, as Steve Jobs always used to say back at Apple. I think that's a great way of looking at it as well. Tomash, you mentioned that in the second round, you raised capital. Yolo Group came on board, then with Tim Heath and Julian and the guys over there. How important have they been, and how have they helped you to build the company since they came on board?
Yeah, I'll actually tell the story of how it happened. So I was at SBC Barcelona first pitch competition, and we ended up winning. And Pontus, who was the kind of one of the judges, ended up giving me a nice jersey with the Sportbet.io logo on it as a prize, and then we just kept talking, and then I met Julian and everybody else, and Tim and Steve, and so they ended up investing, and it was probably at the time, and even still, one of the more strategic investors that we have. We have a few others, Happy Hour, for example, shout out to them, who are all not just capital, but just tremendous amount of industry savviness, network, experience, which for someone like myself, who did not come from the industry, is invaluable. Not that I didn't have that around me before, again, I've mentioned some pretty important names earlier, but the more of it you have, the bigger your reach becomes, and the wiser you become, because you can learn in theory versus in practice, right? So a lot of lessons start to kind of land home before you have to go through them, and that's quite important. And for Yolo specifically, that there's just so much within that network around prospects, around know-how that has been really, really helpful. So I'm really, really glad that they came on and then came on in the third round and kind of continue being one of our top supporters.
Great stuff, Thomas. And the final question for you here today is, where do you see the company in, say, 3 years' time? Where are you hoping to be at that point?
The mission for me is to, I think I'll actually talk about it through the lens of what I'm seeing now. So when we started, as I said, one of the insecurities that you have is, well, will our product be profitable, or will people like it? And what we see now is not just that people like it and it's profitable, but some behavior where we see a person betting like 120 times in a day because they've bet like 30 times in one game. That game ends. Let's say the Liverpool game was early. Then the Man City game starts and the person shows up again and they're betting. And then the Man United game starts after that. And so we're literally seeing hundreds of bets per person per game. And they're profitable bets, but it's not in a like zero-sum game where they just lose all their money or win all their money. They're having fun because they're going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, right? And so eventually it's been like 6 hours and you've bet hundreds of times and you're like, okay, maybe I've lost X amount of dollars, but I've had 6 hours of entertainment. And so I think where I'd like us to be is to try and bring that particular experience that I've just described to the masses, as I said, which has always been the case. And if we can, not necessarily through the identical product that we built today, but through a variation of things that we're working on now, but I'm very confident that we can be an important player within the in-game betting experience of the world, because we also focus, like soccer is our top sport, for example, versus some other companies who focus on North American sports exclusively. So I think we want to be a global leader in kind of the most engaging in-game betting experiences. Let's just put a broad kind of definition on that, but it has some very specific outcomes.
Well, it's been great to follow your journey so far, Tomash, and I'm really looking forward to redo this podcast in 3 years' time to see where we are at that point. And obviously, I'll see you in New York in a couple of months as well. And thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. All the best.